All right, welcome everybody. We've got another episode of Lifestyle Medicine. Today we have Caitlin Thompson, who is the owner and founder of EntheoZen, which is a play off of, right, EntheoZen?
Mm-hmm.
So, Caitlin, give us a rundown of EntheoZen, what you're doing, and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, so EntheoZen is a nutritional supplement company that I founded about 5.5 years ago, and really we cater to brain and mood health. Our bigger sort of overarching theme is mental wellness. So we create products based on cutting edge neuroscience principles with natural ingredients that are safe and sustainable ways to manage and heal from and mitigate the effects of depression, anxiety, low mood, brain fog. I mean, really just overall, when the brain's not working, you don't feel happy. And just sort of a bigger mission of creating tools and sharing information and pioneering research that's going to empower people to take control of their mental health and have solutions that are effective and that are sustainable and aren't going to create some of the side effects that maybe antidepressants would.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the impetus of this and like you starting this and going in this direction, was this a result of you having difficulties in that space and also potentially using pharmaceuticals and that not going well? Or what was the big push to go this direction?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story, in that it'll marry in my sort of passion about psychedelics as well, which I'm sure we'll touch on.
For sure.
So when I was about like 15, 16, got hit with substantial depression and anxiety. I mean, who isn't depressed when they're a teenager,
Sure.
And then I actually started smoking marijuana when I was like 17, and then I was feeling a lot happier, and I'm like, okay, cool. And then the age of 18, I started exploring with taking mind-altering substances. I started out with MDMA, like in the rave scene, and then quickly moved on to things like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca. And so it was actually, I was in my last year of my undergraduate degree in neurobiology, and I was like starting to, I had some hard classes, and so I was like, I'm just gonna take a little time off of like festivals and parties and focus on school to just get through this organic chemistry and all this calculus and stuff.
Yeah.
And what I found, I accidentally discovered that the longer I would go without a regular LSD experience, the more sort of chemically unraveled I was becoming. So I was feeling like every 7 to 8 weeks after my last LSD experience, I would notice that I was just starting to feel really imbalanced and agitated and anxious and depressed. I'm like, that's weird. My life is the same. Like it's not like anything catastrophic has happened. And it took about 3 or 4 times of this happening like clockwork at that 7 to 8 week mark. And I started to put the dots together, and I'm like, oh, I have depression and anxiety that I've been medicating with psychedelic drugs for the last, 4 years, 5 years.
Right.
And I was like, holy cow. And depression runs in my family. I have family members that have been on SSRIs for most of their lives. And I always thought that I was just lucky and kind of skirted past it. So having this awareness that there was this inherent imbalance, and it felt very much physiological because it wasn't really context related. So I was like, okay, it's great to know that psychedelics are effective for that, but I want to really unwind the root of it, because psychedelics are, they're illegal, and they require an investment of all day, and they're not always accessible. So I started to get really fascinated with the scientific literature on mood disorders and depression and anxiety. Mm-hmm. And in my sort of intuitive quest for finding something that was really addressing the root cause, I, of course, stumbled upon the literature around nutrition's role in brain and mood health. And I just kind of fell down this rabbit hole of scientific literature and started experimenting with a lot of different herbs and nutrients, and then kind of got into the whole microbiome aspect of things and was exploring with, probiotics and altering microbiota with different things. And it all kind of accidentally led to this really deep, long healing process of discovering that I actually had Lyme disease. And, I had all these chronic autoimmune conditions for years, and I never even knew I was sick because I had always been told that you're fine, it's normal.
Right.
But it didn't seem normal for a young person to need to sleep 13 hours a day and still be able to nap under fluorescent lights in the school library at 10 a.m.,
Right.
So then it kind of evolved into me being an advocate and a researcher and an educational speaker on chronic autoimmune conditions and chronic illness in general, which a lot of times people are experiencing depression and anxiety who have those conditions as well.
Right.
So yeah, it was this beautiful unfolding process that I kind of just stumbled into, and created EntheoZen as a way to share the information that I had collected from years of reading papers, going to conferences, talking with doctors, with naturopaths, with herbalists, with organic chemists, with psychedelic researchers, and kind of just like putting it all together and synthesizing the information in a way that provides a holistic approach to thriving and achieving mental wellness.
Wow. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. It's great. I love it. I have a lot of questions. So, backtracking a little bit. So for the people that don't know, you and I both know, but the word EntheoZen, if people don't know what that is, can you give a brief definition to that so people that are not hip to that phrase, they know what you're talking about?
Yeah, so an entheogen is a plant that induces a spiritual experience. The root of it is Greek, I believe, and it actually translates to generate the divine from within. In theo, as in God, and
theological,
in gen,
right.
generate. Yeah, and so what it really is referring to is sort of psychoactive plants. So
right.
Most commonly, people will refer to things like psilocybin or ayahuasca or peyote as entheogens. Some people will even consider LSD an entheogen, even though it's synthetic and not necessarily existing in nature. But also people will consider things like passiflora or passion flower or different herbs like canna entheogenic because they do have mild psychoactive properties in their plants. So.
Very good. Excellent definition. That'll give a framework for everybody who doesn't know. And talk to me a little bit more about the Lyme disease. So how far along, were you in your health journey? Like how far had you gone? How many years undiagnosed had you been suffering from that before you got the green light and were like, oh, something's wrong?
When I got an official diagnosis, I was, I think, about 26 years old. I'm now 28. Wow. So it wasn't that long ago I kind of had accepted and knew that I had Lyme before that, but I wasn't getting a lot of support from friends or family. And so, I was really just at a dark spot and was debilitated, couldn't really work and support myself. And people were like, I just don't get it. Maybe you should drink coffee. And I wasn't getting a lot of support, so I spent thousands of dollars on diagnostic testing, literally just to prove that I actually had something wrong with me.
Wow.
But it was probably about, age 25 or so when I started to even recognize Lyme disease as a thing. And, I always thought, oh, you get bit by a tick, you get antibiotics right away, you get a rash. It's actually much more complex than that. And Lyme bacteria actually is affecting a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It lives in a lot of people who aren't sick, and it's one of the pieces of the puzzle in a lot of people that have chronic illness. And really, Lyme disease is just kind of a name, a syndrome more than anything, than an actual infection. But it's a very complicated illness, and it turns out you can actually acquire it from a lot of different vectors other than ticks. There's some skepticism about, maybe it's sexually transmitted because it is a spirochete, just like chlamydia is.
Oh,
and
wow.
it has been detected in sexual fluids. It's not clear if it's transmittable yet, but there's likely a chance that it could be sexually transmitted. And also there's been plenty of documented incidents of women giving birth and passing it on to their child, which in my case, I think is how I acquired it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, I think it doesn't have that much to do with the Lyme organism itself. I think
Right.
with chronic illness, you start with a compromised individual, whether there is trauma or chronic stress or a physical toxin that's compromising the
Yeah.
person. Bacteria, they just take opportunity, and if you're not able to keep a boundary with how much they can grow, then they create, infections, more or less.
Right. Then there's a problem. Right. Then they get a hold in the body and they have the upper hand. Well, that's fascinating because that's the first I've ever heard of Lyme potentially being entering the body in that way. So when this is kind of a nice segue into the other piece that I know that you practice. You're also a Kambo practitioner,
Yeah.
and you facilitate that for people. And I had who I think Neil Hennigar was episode 2 of Lifestyle Medicine, and he's a Kambo practitioner, and we talked pretty much exclusively about Kambo. But I would like to touch back on that because it's always good to hear about these things from a different person through a different lens, and just to get a different framework. So part of what I had talked with Neil about and what we had touched on and with other Kambo practitioners that I had just kind of bumped elbows with, one of the things they talked about was seeing tremendous effect with the treatment of Lyme disease with the use of Kambo. That was like the big showstopper was people that I know who have Lyme. That was originally why I referred them to practitioners of Kambo. I was saying, I've heard this, and it's all sort of secondhand, but I've heard very powerful stories about people sometimes fully reversing Lyme's with the use of Kambo. So did your diagnosis of Lyme put you into dialogue or in search of Kambo, or did Kambo play a role in helping you? I would love to hear that piece.
Yeah, so I will say that I'm a practitioner and a healthy person because of that medicine.
Yeah.
Not exclusively. Of course, I did a lot of other work that was crucial for completing the process. What's interesting is I actually did the frog medicine before I realized that Lyme was a factor. I was just starting to figure out that maybe I actually was sick for a long time, right when the Kambo showed up, or Kambo, tomato.
Yeah.
And it actually, I feel like, was an ally in helping me uproot the deeper understanding of what was happening in my physical body. Yeah, I would say it was the single most powerful tool to help me recover from my chronic illness, and that's why I've dedicated a lot of my time to it this day. And of course, I attract a lot of people with Lyme disease and chronic illness because they resonate with my story and recovery. And I continue to see it as this incredible tool that's completely unrivaled by any other treatment that currently exists. Diet is important, trauma work's important, antimicrobial herbs is important, but as far as bang for your buck, I have never seen anything that provides as much traction forward as this medicine for chronically ill people.
Yeah, it's a powerhouse. The research on it is obviously developing, and the research that I'm hearing about, and for me, it's always kind of a double-edged sword. Like, I think research is incredibly important. It's absolutely important in the West in terms of how things gain traction. And there's also a big piece of, I love hearing about people's personal experience. That's always a big selling point for me, because a lot of things for years, right, won't be given the green light by the FDA or by something for many, many years. And people can still be having tremendous effect. So I always listen to people's personal experience and listen to their personal testimony about that. So when you've, in your experience with the Kambo, what have you seen from people? You've facilitated a lot of ceremonies for people. You've administered Kambo to to people. So what have you seen in terms of, I guess, people's healings? You know, what have you seen from people that started taking Kambo? What has been some of the interesting tidbits that you've come across?
Yeah, I'll start with saying I've seen a lot of weird shit, man.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's a weird substance for sure.
It is.
Yeah, you know, part of it is I'm not quite sure about everyone because I do follow up with them a few days after, but long term, I really kind of, you know, don't know what their life is looking like after that.
Mm-hmm.
But from the little bits I've had, people felt like it was profoundly helpful in raising their baseline of health. A lot of people report not getting like sick, not getting colds or flu for extended amounts of time, which is not like them because they're usually quite immune compromised people.
Yep.
I did have one client with Epstein-Barr who was debilitated with that virus, and she actually flew in to see me from Reno, and she did 2 sessions with me, two days in a row, back-to-back sessions, and it's been a year, and she's still in full remission from her Epstein-Barr. Like, those 2 sessions cured her. I mean, I shouldn't say cured, but, like, really, they resolved the symptoms, and to this day, she's a healthy, thriving person and attributes all of it to the Kambo. So I've seen people that, you know, maybe have a bowel movement once a week, and that's been, you know, they've been hospitalized over the years for constipation.
Wow.
And they come and do 1 session and they have bowel movements daily afterwards.
Wow.
I've seen exorcisms happen pretty much. You know, people screaming. I've had people who came for detox purposes, but, you know, had no intention of having a spiritual experience, and they're laying on the mat afterwards, and all of a sudden they start talking to me about an incident that happened to them as a child when their mother yelled at them, and how they really see that stuck with them and it affected them. I mean, it's very weird, and a lot of the healing and such really it unfolds in the next days and weeks after the experience. It's not so much like ayahuasca where maybe you purge and it feels very consequential and you're like, oh, I knew exactly what I was purging and I had this vision. It's not like that. It's kind of like you pay up front, and then the next days and weeks there's this really beautiful, gentle unfolding and unveiling process. And all of a sudden, stuff just starts to get bubbled up and pulled to the surface, and it's right there. And you really can't escape it. And it can kind of be very catalytic and a bit disruptive. Certainly for me, not everybody, but I kind of had a life meltdown after that, which I always say I was bulldozing my cottage to build a castle. And, I mean, it catalyze a long transformative process that required a lot of work and pain and, like, you know, leaps of faith, you know, giving up certain patterns and beliefs and behaviors in order to jump to a new standard of being. But it was a difficult process. But, you know, I was also like 25 years old when that was happening, which, you know, these are kind of formative years of your life in your 20s, and there's a lot of growing and breaking down and rebuilding happening anyways. So
absolutely. Man, there's just so much here. It's great. I love hearing your experience, because I think there's a lot of people who are curious about Kambo. I think it's a piece that they've either heard about it, you know, through podcasting, through side channels, and then are curious if they're, you know, a candidate for it, or how it could help them potentially. So, you know, my personal experience, I've only sat with Kambo twice. And when I sat with it both times, the first ceremony was very difficult in terms of my body had a lot of resistance, and I finally kind of let go. The second day I resisted less and it went better. It was an easier process, still rough. You know, obviously Kambo is pretty rough. But I noticed, you know, what you're talking about, that baseline level where it feels like you're something about your internal health frequency, it just seems like it gets leveled up, because that was the first thing that I noticed when I had I purged, I was sweating, and I felt terrible for that 20 minutes. And I remember I laid down for another 20 or 30, and when I got up, I remember thinking like I had done something very it felt like I had been like exercising for days. That's kind of I thought like that euphoria, that kind of endorphin rush of like, wow, I feel like I've been training or something. And so when I came out, I felt fantastic, and that was and that stayed. You know, that was a feeling. I thought, I mean, I'm due for another one, and I would like to get another ceremony, but I was surprised at how a short 20-minute window of hell brings about this long-standing feeling good. You know, that was just kind of amazing to me. Can you talk about the concept? I had a person just recently ask me about this, and I spoke on it as much as I know, but I would love to hear your thoughts. This idea of panema, which is kind of the indigenous idea about the sort of like what it purges from your body. I've heard that phrase, and I've heard it described as sort of like an energetic phlegm. I've heard it described as a kind of a form of bad luck. But I would love to hear your take on that in relation to Kambo and how it relates to it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about panema, other than kind of what it says on Wikipedia is it's kind of like a funk, a bad luck, a dark cloud of energy. And, I always find, I really like to bridge the gaps between science and spirituality and kind of see the congruence between them. And my interpretation of panema on like a sort of a biochemical, physiological manifestation is maybe like inflammation and microbial dysbiosis, because those things definitely cause lethargy and brain fog and, where you're just not like, you're feeling heavy, you're not feeling light, you're not feeling quick-witted. And it's this very like low level chronic inflammatory sort of situation in the body. So that's kind of my interpretation of what panema is on a more Western scientific model of things. And I also don't think that those are separate. I think that, they're different versions of the same truth,
I agree completely. And I think that's a good way to look at it nowadays, especially because I think with the advancement of these medicines, especially indigenous medicines, as they come into the culture, American culture more, I think Americans, we kind of science is like the new religion. Science is seen as like the holy altar that can't be
dogma, man.
It's fully dogma, right? And to a fault nowadays, where it's if you step outside of it, you're just a loon. You're seen as crazy if you question and not necessarily believe every single study that comes out. But I think it's really important to talk about these substances from both sides, because I think it gives people an access point too. I think Americans kind of need that mental stimulation to be like, okay, what are you talking about? Or is this new age fluff? Where's the grounding? Where's the standing? Does this actually have any relevance to the American mind? And I think that's important. So I think it's good to talk about it like that. I really do. Like, I've seen people not talk about it. And it's not that it can't have merit and effect, but I think that there's more traction had when people talk about it from the Western perspective too. It's important.
Yeah. Well, you have to use the language that people feel familiar with. And currently, many people, not all, trust me, but many people find science to be the way to validate whether something is true or not to them.
Yeah.
And certainly with Kambo medicine, there's a lot of, thousands of papers on the individual peptides, but that's not the way people are ingesting this. And there's absolutely no research on people receiving this medicine through the traditional means. There's a couple case reports of people that, maybe went to the emergency room because they drank too much water or something dumb like that. Yeah. But there really isn't any studies at all. And being a scientist, that kind of like hurts me. I'm like, Jesus Christ. But I'm in the process right now of kind of transitioning from being a full-time practitioner to being a researcher that's working with practitioners, because that really feels more my place in this Kambo world. I've been collecting data since August, and we just applied for our first IRB actually to do some retroactive data analysis, just really preliminary stuff like demographic information, like, how often are people fainting? How often are they having bowel movements?
Right.
Is there any correlation between face swelling and gender or number of points, or just looking for any connections there at all?
Right.
And then in the future, our intention is to start by administering wellness scales or challenging experience scales or mood depression scales, like, any sort of really simple, just like survey before and after, or even, long-term follow-ups,
Right.
just so that we can even record that there is substantial, mental health benefit to this medicine. And like you were describing about, things becoming pharmaceuticals and going through that whole process, it's kind of tricky to do research on a substance that you don't actually really intend to have become a drug by the FDA standards.
Right.
Because if you're going to work on any population that's not considered healthy, you have to apply for an investigational drug application. And there's no way that the FDA or anyone would ever fund that, because why do that when you can patent a peptide? You can't patent, the whole secretion, and it's, you can't get them from frogs outside of their native habitat. So
Right.
there's also, while the frogs are plentiful and in fine supply now, there is sustainability concerns about if this were to become a widespread medicine, is there really enough frogs to sustain high concentrations of this secretion without compromising their ability to defend themselves?
Right. It's such a important point to consider nowadays, especially sustainability in general. I think just with the population of people, how much, the world is just kind of a crazy place, and population plays a role, right? And then in the processing and the standardization of medicines. One of the interesting things that I talked about with Neil when we had that conversation in episode 2 was he was talking about that when they had pulled some of these frogs out into laboratories and had contained them and taken the secretions, apparently the medicine wasn't working the same. It was greatly diminished, apparently, which was sort of pointing to, we talked about this, but it seems like the frogs are interfacing with something in the environment, or just their natural habitat facilitates some kind of physiology in their body to where they actually produce the appropriate peptides in that secretion. So he was saying, he's like, in a way, it's almost like nature has built a fail-safe mechanism. Like, you can't really take the frog out of its home and bastardize it and process it and standardize it and expect it to still do what it's going to do, which was kind of interesting. I thought that's really fascinating that it wasn't working as well in that context.
That's certainly the rumor. I don't know that I've actually seen that to be valid and true. Like, I've heard that, but I haven't seen a paper, writing about that. I have actually read a paper about then having frogs in captivity and then doing bioassays of the secretion that they took from the captive frog. And it might be different as far as a clinical application of actually administering the medicine, but there were certainly still peptides in there. And they talked about the frog's diet, and it's eating crickets with vitamins sprinkled on it and shit like that. So I do wonder if that's actually true, or if that's something that maybe somebody made up so that people wouldn't even try to take them out of captivity, which I'm okay with that,
Yeah, fair enough. But it's good to understand like where the story comes from.
I wonder how true anything is. And something also really interesting that I came across in a paper that I don't know that really anyone in the Kambo community realizes, but there's different peptides and different concentration of peptides in different glands on the frog's body. For example, the tibial gland on their legs has the highest potency, and it has peptides that aren't found in the other glands, like behind the head and such. And that's likely an adaptive defense mechanism, because if you're trying to run away and a snake's got your legs, you want that to be your strongest, defense. So, when you're getting these highly variations of potency on a stick or between sticks, no one's considering which glands these are coming from, and so there's just a lot. It's a lot of hearsay, a lot of rumor, with pretty much zero science for anyone to grab onto, and that unfortunately I think also creates risk and illegitimacy. So it'd be nice if there could be a sort of a dignified way of bringing some fact to the community without bastardizing the sacredness of what it really is.
Right, it's a fine line, right? To figure out how to walk that line and to dance it effectively, where people are still benefiting but without damaging, right?
Yeah, or exploiting. For
exploiting
sure.
it. Right. That's really important. Well, Caitlin, we had talked about in our call before this podcast just a little bit about your science background. So why don't you tell people a little bit about that? Because that was interesting. Your background is in, what was it again?
It's in neurobiology.
Yeah. So that was sort of your foundation. You come at this from a science perspective to a degree, and you're wanting to validate it that way. It sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not attached to validating anything because at the end of the day, my experiences are more important to me than what a paper says. But I do think that it kind of clears the air with controversy.
Sure.
Is this safe? Is this effective? I think it's nice to be able to share information with others in a language that they're gonna feel good about receiving it in, which is science for some people.
Yeah.
I mean, I have always been fascinated by life, you know, and nature, animals, plants as a child. And, kind of just like chose a major, like, well, whatever, biology sounds cool. Yeah. And then actually found myself really into it. And, in my undergraduate, when I was going to college and studying biology, I was also taking a lot of psychedelics. Yeah. I was going to Burning Man. I mean, by the age of 21, I was going to Peru for ayahuasca retreats by myself, and really kind of started early in my spiritual exploration, and was simultaneously learning about molecular biology and organic chemistry and neurobiology while I was having these really opening sort of period of my life. And it was actually the psychedelics that like really inspired me and helped me become fascinated with science because I saw the spirit in everything. I remember being in biochemistry and we're learning about these very specific, pathways and binding of proteins and how they fold and how they change their conformation based on this electrical, bonding that, the electron moves here, blah, blah. It's complex. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, how could anyone learn this shit and not have a spiritual experience realizing the intelligence of all of this? And I know that's different for a lot of other people. They see it more as like an algorithmic pattern that fell into place through trial and error.
Right.
But I think that's sort of underestimating the intelligence of how nature has put itself together in the most brilliant way. So learning about science actually made me more spiritual and not religious. There's a difference.
Yeah.
But yeah, really just appreciating the brilliance of nature and the algorithmic intelligence and scientific manifestations of consciousness.
Yeah. Recently, it's just funny because these questions, absolutely. Like I agree with you that idea of you can see a design, right? There's something about the functionality of how things work at a molecular level and life in general, I think is just, you and I are on the same page. My daughter recently, we were outside and we were talking about something. We said something to the effect of like, my heart feels good, or she said something like that. We were looking at ants and she goes, Papa, do they have hearts? And then I was like, yeah. And she's like, and then we started talking. She had questions, like, do they have insides? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, but they're so little, there's like, how do these little tiny working parts fit in there? I was like, that's a good question, baby. I said, I don't know. At least I said, it's, it seems designed, but in any case, the other piece I want to ask you about is receptivity to, I guess, this topic and I guess these substances. So when I have talked about it, people for the most part, and I think it's how you deliver the story, of course, but I've tried to talk about it in a rational way. I've talked about it from a personal experience way. I don't know if you've seen some of my previous stuff that I've put out, but, in the last year, I've peeled back a little bit because I feel like after a year I got a lot out of it, but I sat with psilocybin quite a bit, about 9 times over the course of a year, and it was strictly from a therapeutic perspective. It wasn't a recreational thing for me. I was struggling and I wanted help, and I was also helping a couple people kind of, get ushered into it. And so far receptivity, like when I talk about it, is pretty good. People are actually interested. It seems like people are wanting to hear about it. It's an interesting topic. They want to hear about the altered states. They want to hear about how it could potentially be relevant to them. And I would love to hear your dialogue with it thus far. Have you hit what I would call the Bible Belt rebellion, where people are just like, no, this is totally like the devil, this is bad to be doing this or to be, partaking in these kinds of things, because I know that culture is out there, and I've heard about it and I've seen it more on online content, but I'm just curious what how has it been received, you talking about this stuff, your dialogue with it, what's that been like?
Yeah, so I've certainly seen a pretty rapid change in the public just in the last 5 years, and I think a lot of that has to do with the publicity and the traction that the research is getting, and organizations like MAPS and the Beckley Foundation, and just the science that's coming out, because it's like, okay, you guys wanted science, here it is, right. And it's like, you can argue with it, but you look like a silly, little person that's attached to their paradigm. Right. And certainly in the beginning, I think there was more pushback and more resistance. And I also was younger, and maybe people didn't find me to be a person of authority at that point.
Sure.
But I just continued to share because I really felt that there was no shame around any of the experiences that I was having, and I felt like my intent to share them was pure, and because of that, I just had no reservation about sharing my truth, because I wasn't convinced that what I was doing was wrong, even though it might have been illegal. Mm-hmm. And I just kept sharing, like, authentically. And definitely in the beginning, people would really try to put me in a box and try to figure out who I was, because they're like, well, you use drugs, you must be a loser, you must be an addict, must be. But then I was able to show up in ways with integrity, with kindness, with fun, with intellect, with accomplishment, with competency, and it just kind of threw people for a loop. And then as I've grown and stepped more into my power and a place of authority to be able to speak on these things, I get a lot less pushback. But I also think times are just changing. Like the amount of exposure that we've seen in the media over the last 3 years, especially, is just is exponential. And it's like, look, guys, like, are you going to deprive people of something that is effectively going to treat this horrible condition that we don't have current methods that are effective? Like, if you say yes, you're a jerk, Like your closed-mindedness is hurting other people. Don't be selfish. Don't be a jerk. Let the science speak for itself, and, it'll go through the steps of any other drug that people are on. Yeah. And, why is it okay for an antidepressant to go through but not MDMA? You know?
Yeah, legitimate. I mean, I think that's this what I would call the social propaganda from so many years. When I was growing up, I'm older than you. I'm 37, and I was born in 81, and through the 80s and the 90s, there was so much of the and I think, of course, right, there was definitely abuse in the culture, and there was the say no to drugs movement. But then I think there was a distinction, right, where there's a classification of these things being lumped together. Cannabis still, in the same schedule as heroin and these kinds of things, where it's like, okay, wild. Like, let's all take a step back and be reasonable for a minute, and like, let's not, like, let's be reasonable, please, because I feel like that's getting lost sometimes. So I think with the advancement of this stuff, it's important, right, to talk about it, to get people to consider it differently than the way it was presented in, say, the 80s and 90s, the way it was really pushed. And I get that, right? I'm not, I really do, but I think I agree with you. I think the times are shifting, and MAPS, which is just amazing. I track all of that information, and I track them. So with the psychedelic use, what are your thoughts on, because I talk about this, but I would love to hear how you kind of frame this. When I have talked to people about psychedelic use, and primarily as a way, I want to be careful with my words, not to counteract the way we think in American culture, but I maybe harmonize and balance. There's sort of this has been my experiences when I've sat with psychedelics. I feel like, naturally I'm an artist. I'm like intuitive, emotional, abstract in my thinking. But I think the West, we're very linear, we're very compartmentalized, we're very straightforward, and that can be very good and it can be very detrimental. And it seems like psychedelics kind of put you into that realm where you're being forced to confront the abstract, the nonlinear, the amorphous, the formless. Like all of that is sort of in the forefront. And if nothing else, it seems like people have really, they benefit from that, even if they don't understand it. They've just been exposed to a different filter, right? There's our 3D reality filter that we're kind of always doing, and then you go down that road for a little while and you're like, wow, that's a completely different way to feel and experience the world. So for that alone, I think for looking through a different lens, I think it's good for people. Oftentimes it's not for everybody, but I think it's good for a lot of people. So what do you think in terms of the psychedelic movement, the advancement of psychedelics and these psychotropic substances? Like what role do you think it plays, and why is it important?
Ooh, it's a very loaded question.
Yeah.
I see a pretty widespread application for them, both in physical medicine. I do a lot of lectures on psychedelics for autoimmune conditions, because there's anti-inflammatory and immune modulating properties and antimicrobial properties, and there's a whole untapped sort of field of medicine that's not even psychiatric.
Let's bookmark that. Let's bookmark that. Keep going.
Bookmark. Okay.
Bookmark that. Autoimmune and psychedelics. We'll touch on that in a minute. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, and then of course there's psychiatric conditions, which is getting a lot of the attention and resources right now. Yeah. And then there's potential for them to actually really alter paradigms in human behavior and culture, and in effect influence art, influence war, influence compassion, influence spiritual practices or the creation of new spiritual practices. And I'm personally not opposed to people using it recreationally. I think sometimes people are like, well, if it's recreational, it's not okay. You have to be sick to need it.
For sure.
Which I think is also not a model that's serving, why not take preventative medicine? Why not keep yourself well instead of, justifying a medicine when it's too far and you hit a wall. I think, you can find a lot of healing and nourishment through recreation with intention and responsibility.
Yeah.
I see them as really tools that can catalyze a lot on this planet. You're talking about this sort of ability for them to pull people out of these rigid patterns of thinking, and that's a very real, measurable thing with psychedelics. They are disruptive to the brain. They increase sort of chaos, and they disrupt the very rigid networking patterning that the brain puts into place in order to create routine, so that a lot of things can be unconscious, so that we free up more bandwidth to focus on more conscious things.
Yeah.
And there's actually a word for this system. It's called the default mode network. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No.
It's a network consists of a series of brain regions that communicate between each other, and the default mode network it's there to sort of lock in a pattern of consistency to filter out information. So you're talking about this filter. It's just a filter, really, because there's so much sensory data coming through, and your brain's like, all right, let's see what's actually important. Is a lion about to kill me? Is someone saying my name across the room?
Right.
What information is actually worth consciously, taking in? And it sometimes can get too rigid and too stuck. The connectivity can actually become too strong. And that's when you start to get things like rumination and depressive thoughts, and you feel stuck or stagnant.
Right.
And so the psychedelics, along with other alternative therapies such as float tanks, such as meditation practice, and probably also Kambo, I would assume, and maybe even some herbs and stuff. Who knows what else?
Right.
Exercise maybe, but they all seem to disrupt the strong connectivity of the default mode network, which is where you have the disruption happening, where they can step back and get some fresh perspective because they're suddenly not running the same autopilot program that they were stuck in for the last 5 years. And they're like, oh, wow, I actually can, see a different point of view and have compassion for the situation or whatever. And also because they're disruptive to brain networks that have been, holding down the fort,
right.
They also disrupt our ability to suppress painful memories and such. And it's really in that disruption, we disrupt our coping mechanisms for just blocking off emotional pain. And through that is where you have it coming up and out and able to be resolved and worked with. And that's, one of the sort of ways that trauma and PTSD and stuff gets a lot of benefit from the psychedelics. Is just like you can't like stuff it down anymore. It gets inherently just like flies up to the surface because the structure to suppress it is no longer in place.
Right. Yeah. Quite literally confronted with what has been buried. Right. What's been down there or not functioning well. It's really interesting what you said, and just as kind of a side question, but it's in relation to what you were just talking about. Are you familiar with? Have you read about Leonardo da Vinci's brain at all? Like they've
No.
So Da Vinci, the reason I'm talking about this is this brain neural connection. So Leonardo da Vinci was one of the ultimate geniuses of all time, and he was an artistic genius. But what they found was he was a really accomplished scientist and was innovative in sciences. He could sing incredibly well. He could dance. He could playwright. He was amazing at mathematics. The guy had his both feet fully planted in science and art. And the only area he struggled, like a normal person, shouldn't even say struggle, he could still do it, was language. So if he sat down to learn French, he was as slow as the average person. But that was pretty much the only area he was. And what they speculate was that the left and right hemispheres of his brain were firing damn near perfect, like 50-50, or like 49-51. Like they were so close, which is where they say true genius resides, is right when the left and right hemispheres of the brain, that neural membrane, whatever you want to call it, between those two hemispheres, they connect and they link.
Corpus callosum.
Yeah. So when they link up appropriately, right, and it's balanced, we get this really expansive, integrative thinking that can be applied, right, in a linear way or in an abstract way. And it makes me think about this because I think what you're talking about, what was the network called again? The
corpus callosum. It's like a big bundle of nerves that connects the signals between.
Okay.
The default mode network.
Mode network. But thank you for the corpus callosum. That's great to know too. That default mode network. I mean, that's even the phraseology of that makes me think about so many. When I think about like politics and I think about politicians or anyone in any field, I guess getting so rigid in their thinking, like you said before, right? Science has become dogma now. It's like the new religion, right? And if you question it or go against it or whatever, there can be just this huge railback, where people are just like, wait, you can't question this thing that's infallible, more or less. And it makes me think about all these different fields of people getting so rigid, so stuck, and so glued to their position about being right or being in the know or whatever it is. I mean, I think that's why it's so important for us, because I think what that happens, at least at the cultural level, what I've seen with people is people stop communicating, right? It's just like the insides of our brain, right? Like one side, we compartmentalize, we shut down. And people, right? People that disagree even, it's like people don't talk anymore. They're not communicating anymore. And it's because people are so pitted and they're so ingrained and got their feet so buried in the sand with their position, they're not willing to budge. They're not willing to actually walk in someone else's moccasins and listen, or to like push outside that envelope and be like, let's just hear another person's experience and let's see what that's like and, integrate. And I think that's the piece I've seen with the psychedelics that are so powerful, is just that default mode network. I love that phrase. I'm totally going to look that up now. But pulling people out of that, right? That seems like a pretty reasonable reason to do it, like a pretty good reason to potentially dialogue with these things. So with this, with this psychedelic thing, let's go back to the autoimmune piece. That's really fascinating. So you said that what they're seeing is potentially is this so psychedelics potentially helping autoimmune conditions? Is that some of the research you've seen?
So I'll tell you, nobody's doing research on this. There's like one guy that I know who's kind of on the same kick that I am, and we talk about it sometimes. But he's published a couple of papers just looking at immunomodulation and inflammatory cytokines and stuff in response mostly to DMT and 5-MeO DMT with the sigma-1 receptor. But I've just been collecting a lot of evidence that there is something there that needs to be investigated, and I've been synthesizing all the information. And of course, autoimmune conditions are very multifaceted. It's never caused from one thing.
Sure.
But most often there's an element of trauma and autonomic nervous system disruption. There's usually some sort of toxin implicated, whether it's like a food allergen or mold exposure or metals or something.
Right.
And there's almost always some organism involved or lots of organisms involved in dysbiosis. And honestly, I think it all originates from the trauma. That's been my experience dealing with clients and in my own personal work. But there's a lot of multifaceted ways that psychedelics can kind of address all these different pieces of autoimmunity. And what I found is there's some evidence that there's anti-inflammatory effects. There's reduction in things like tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha, and some of the interleukin pro-inflammatory cytokines. There's also been elevation of anti-inflammatory cytokines. And then there's immune modulation that's happening too through a couple different mechanisms. So there's a ton of literature on how neurotransmitters are found to be immune modulating molecules. And actually, depending on the tissue, the same, for example, serotonin binding to the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the target of most psychedelic drugs, actually has different effects depending on what type of cell in the body, what type of immune cell, where the tissue is located, which is fascinating.
Wow.
So serotonin seems to have some sort of influence on immune modulation in a whole variety of ways, everything from inflammatory cytokine to apoptosis to cell repair. I mean, all sorts of different immune responses. And so, these compounds are binding to receptors that are endogenously in there to bind to neurotransmitters. And so there's some stuff going on for sure.
Yeah.
That, these psychedelics could be modulating a lot of downstream stuff. And I just stumbled upon a paper recently that shows that serotonin is actually able to epigenetically add itself to DNA like a tag in the same way that we have seen methyl and acetyl groups added to DNA histones, which will change the transcription of a gene and change protein, expression, and essentially is epigenetic. And there's also some antimicrobial properties to some of the psychedelics. The one we know the best at this point is like the Harmala alkaloids in the ayahuasca vine, and San Pedro and peyote have shown to be effective against things like MRSA.
Wow.
Yeah, and so a lot of these people have chronic infections. They have gut dysbiosis. They have overgrowth in their gut. And so having sort of antimicrobial effects, there's also antiviral effects, antifungal effects for things like Candida and herpes viruses, Epstein-Barr. And then the most important piece, I think, is the fact that they are so clearly useful in reprogramming trauma in the way that the autonomic nervous system is stuck in this sympathetic state, because that's really what's causing the autoimmune condition, in my opinion, is a chronic stuck sympathetic state that just makes you a sitting duck for organisms, and everything is inflamed, and so it's more reactive, and it just kind of spirals out of control until next thing you know, you have fibromyalgia, you have Crohn's, you have even depression and anxiety. I kind of think a lot of them are somewhat autoimmune mechanism related. And Yeah, the psychedelics, there's a lot of just uncharted territory there, looking at just the immune system and inflammatory processes. And there is a pretty deep connection between something like aversive childhood experiences, or ACEs, childhood trauma, and the likelihood of developing a chronic illness and an autoimmune disease.
Wow.
So we know that trauma, just by the science, does increase your likelihood of developing a chronic illness. And, another sort of little side thing is, things like psilocybin and DMT, they're very close to serotonin and tryptophan and tryptamines, and bacteria are largely responsible for making most of the serotonin in our bodies. So most of our serotonin is produced in our gut, and the difference between DMT and psilocybin and serotonin is not a lot. It's like one tiny little functional group, and I suspect that, these bacteria, they're creating serotonin byproducts either as a metabolic waste product or as a means of signaling to other bacteria or interacting with their environment. And it makes me wonder, what their response is to some of these very similar analogs to serotonin, like DMT, like psilocin, because I suspect that if they have the hardware to bind to serotonin and chemically participate with that molecule, they probably do for psilocin, for psilocybin, for DMT. So I would love to give some LSD to some bacteria and see what happens.
Well, I'll be sitting attentively waiting to hear about that. Yeah.
It could change microbial behavior in the gut, which could be bad or good. I mean, it could be used as an antimicrobial agent or as a way of promoting diversity, or I don't know. All I know is that there is a lot of potential.
No, it's definitely worth looking at and considering. I mean, that's especially with autoimmunity, it's so prevalent nowadays. Everyone's got the autoimmunity is everywhere. Everyone's got something. That's really fascinating. It's not quote unquote autoimmune related, but last year I was about to go and sit with mushrooms with a friend of mine, both going into it for the same reasons, just wanting to process life and kind of sit and deal with our stuff more or less. And unfortunately, I felt like I was getting sick fully. Like I was fully getting sick. I could just tell. I was like, the day before, I'm getting a sore throat, and it was starting to come, and I was just starting to feel like crap. And I was really on the fence of like, should we do this, or I don't know if I want to go into a psychedelic space and be sick. Like that's not really my jam. I'm not really looking forward to that. And we decided to do it, and it was remarkable. I sat with psilocybin mushrooms, and halfway through the journey, I realized I was like, I'm starting to feel better, and I don't know why, but I'm not feeling as sick. And then by the end of the journey, 5 hours later, 6 hours later, my sore throat symptoms were gone. I was so like I said, it's anecdotal, but I was very surprised that by the end of the ceremony and by the next morning, I was 100%. Like I wasn't sick anymore. I was like, wow, that's never happened. Like I've never been able to reverse something from eating something. I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner, so like I'm into herbs, I'm into lifestyle, dietary stuff. I eat all my ginger, and I'm so like on board with that methodology. And it was amazing, like how much better I felt, and it was that always stayed with me. I kind of got my mind thinking, and then I started, really diving into Paul Stamets' work, who's the mycologist, and he does all of this stuff. He's got so much host defense, right? His whole line is about mushrooms and the immune boosting response. So in any case, that is fascinating in terms of that research. So are you going to, with you going into the research, field and doing this, is this the kind of stuff you kind of want to like look into? Is this the kind of stuff that you want to start like searching for?
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I don't know if low-hanging fruit is the right term, but it has a lot of potential for novel findings. Of course, it's challenging to do any research with psychedelic substances without DEA and FDA approval, which is one of the reasons I've decided to focus on the Kambo for now, because it's currently legal. I'm a practitioner, so I have access to people that are experiencing it, frequently. And I haven't gone like a conventional academic route, and I don't know if I ever will. And part of that is because I don't know that I'm healthy and resilient enough to make it through a graduate degree. And I also don't know that I need to. So my intention is to be in this sort of quasi-academic role where I'm able to pioneer research and perhaps fund it with some of my ventures like EntheoZen. My dream is to eventually for EntheoZen to be a powerhouse for actually funding and facilitating research towards mental wellness on alternative methods like Kambo, like float tanks, like meditation, maybe even psychedelics. We have enough money at that point to jump through all those hoops. So I'd love for it to eventually become, or split off into like a nonprofit research foundation or something where, I can probably play some role in facilitating the research and planning it, and having a science background makes me better than just like a random business person that maybe doesn't understand how research and grants work or IRB process. But I'm probably not going to get a PhD just because I don't know that I need to. Honestly, I can continue to learn the stuff that's on the internet with scientific literature and PubMed and conferences and peers, and why do I need to suffer to just keep learning?
Fair enough, and good on you for having that foresight, because I can relate to it fully. I never wanted to be a doctor, like an MD. It was never like my thing. But I remember going into Chinese medicine school. I'm like, hey, this is going to be 4 or 5 years. It's going to be a lot of money. Could I just go that other route? And I had the same thoughts kick up for me. I was like, I don't think I have the constitution to actually do what MDs do. And my program wiped me out. 5 years of acupuncture school, like I was heavy, inflamed, mentally, like not in a good place when I got out. So good for you for for having, like I said, the foresight to realize that you don't have to suffer necessarily to continue to do the work that you're doing. That's really cool.
I thought about, why, what is it that I would actually want to get out of a graduate degree? Yeah. And I thought of 2 things, and one of them was to further my education, and also to gain research experience, and then the other was to feel validated. And I'm like, well, that's not really a good reason to put myself through 6 years of pain. Right. And I'm like, well, whatever. What if I just pioneered and like learned how to do research through mentorship, and then made accomplishments that gave me credibility? And what if people respected me because of that and not because of the suffering I did to go through a graduate program? I really don't think that it always translates necessarily from school to like capability of being able to make any difference in the world,
Agreed. Yeah. No, like I said, very good. Backtracking a hair. So talking about DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. So dimethyltryptamine is the DMT, but I'm unclear on this. The fully, I know that structurally they're different, but I don't really know the difference and like where you find everything that I know about it in terms of how they differ has come from like episodes of like Vice and documentaries and things like this, where I've seen, I think it's the Sonoran desert frog where they pulled 5-MeO-DMT off of that frog. And then DMT I've heard is, found in ayahuasca. So can you flesh that out and talk about, for the people that don't know, people that are totally green to this topic, but talking about, DMT, what it is, where it's found, and then the difference between that and 5-MeO-DMT and where that's found and where that's sourced?
Yeah, totally. So both of those molecules are found in nature. I'll just refer to regular DMT as NN-DMT versus 5-Methoxy Dmt. Okay. While they're structurally very similar, the experience is different for sure, because people always, say, oh, I did DMT. And I'm like, well, was it 5-MeO-DMT or regular? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, you would know if you smoked 5-MeO-DMT. Yeah. Because the experience is different. I mean, there's some overlapping similarities, but it's a kind of a different journey. As far as where they exist in nature, so DMT is, largely found in a lot of different plants and animals. Mm-hmm. It seems like all living organisms, including bacteria, have the right enzymes and starting materials to produce DMT. So there is a theory that potentially every living creature might be producing DMT to some extent. It's not quite understood what the role of DMT is in the human body or even plants. And there are some plants that also contain 5-MeO-DMT, like Yopo and Wilca, and so some Amazonian plants, and probably others in parts of the world. And then there is the Sonoran desert toad, which is currently the only known animal to contain a psychedelic alkaloid. And there's also synthetic versions, of course, which some people prefer because it's more standardized. And there's concerns also about the ecological impact of milking the toads and stuff like that.
Can I ask a quick question on that? And this is probably going to be a stupid question, but I have thought about this repeatedly, and I would just love to know if you know. So, given that that toad or the frog has that compound in its skin and in its system, fundamentally, I've always just been curious. Does that mean the toad, if it's a part of its body, does that mean that the toad is essentially experiencing a psychedelic experience? I mean, is there a way to even know that? But I always just wonder, if your body produces it, would the toad just be, on a journey 24/7 for its entirety of its life?
That molecule might facilitate a normal state of consciousness that we would consider psychedelic for us, because it's a non-ordinary state for us.
Fair enough.
But they might be operating in a different spiritual plane because that is a normal integrated part of their consciousness. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't either. I figured there wasn't science behind it, but it's a question that I'm always like, so is the frog always on the journey?
I mean, we don't even know what the frog's experiences is like without the DMT.
Correct. Fair enough.
Yeah. It'd be fun if we could.
Yeah, if we could find out, right?
Talk to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
So in any case, I didn't want to stop you completely, but just so keep going. So.
Yeah, and then so DMT is something that is present in ayahuasca brew. It is not present in the ayahuasca vine. So this is something that people are sometimes confused about. So ayahuasca as a brew generally consists of 2 plants. Sometimes there's more, depending on the shaman and the area, the region. And the DMT containing plant can be different depending on each brew.
Right.
But most often you have a DMT containing plant, usually it's chacruna or Psychotria viridis, and then you have the ayahuasca vine. Now, the ayahuasca vine it's like where the magic happens, because if you eat the chacruna DMT plant on its own, we have an enzyme in our guts called monoamine oxidase, and it metabolizes and breaks down the DMT before it's ever going to reach our brain. Which is why we can eat things like oranges that have DMT in it and not have psychedelic experiences. So the ayahuasca vine has these molecules called monoamine oxidase inhibitors. There's a couple different beta-carboline harmala alkaloid molecules in there that do this, and they somehow discovered that when you mix the two, the MAOIs, or the enzyme inhibitors in the ayahuasca vine, they potentiate the DMT in the other plant and allow it to be sort of protected until it reaches the brain, which then produces the psychoactive experience. Now, I've heard some people say that ayahuasca on its own doesn't produce a psychedelic experience. That's absolutely not true. I have done it. I did a ceremony called Natu Mamu, which in the Shuar tradition is when you take just the vine. And it's actually a pretty obscene ceremony where you're drinking liters and liters and liters of this brew and alternating between purging and drinking, and there's someone yelling at you to keep drinking, and it's kind of a shit show. I called it the Shuar frat party is what I called it. Oh my
God, it sounds awful.
But I did that twice, and it was a very unique experience having just the vine, and it is definitely psychoactive on its own. There was nothing else added in that brew except the vine. So to clear that up for anybody that feels that
it's not.
The vine's not active, it definitely is. It's got, the thing is, the MAOIs, they also block the degradation of your own neurotransmitters, such as serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine and other tryptamine molecules. And so if you take an MAOI on its own, which, there are drugs, antidepressant drugs that are MAOIs.
Yep.
They elevate your endogenous sort of experience of your own neurotransmitters, which I find really cool.
Yeah, it is cool.
You're getting high off your own juices, essentially.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Wow. No, it's really fascinating. So when you say this experience is different, what was it called? NN-DMT, which is the quote unquote regular, and then the 5-MeO-DMT. So collectively, again, this has all been secondhand from people that I've spoken to that have said that it's different. So can you, in your experience, how are they different? And I know it's hard to encapsulate the psychedelic experience, but just in the broad stroke, best way possible.
So the NN-DMT, there's a large range of experiences that you can have. And I would say it's, unless you're completely blasting through, it's very much like a strong mushroom experience as far as the visuals, the body feeling. And then when you kind of go a little further in the journey, there's sort of strange spaces that you can get to where you're perhaps encountering entities or beings, or you're looking at what looks like almost like organic machinery or like robotic organisms or something weird like that. These alien worlds, people can have full-blown visions where there's situations happening and they're able to see clearly a vision. With 5-MeO-DMT, you kind of just take the elevator straight to God. Now, people can have this experience if they have a full breakthrough with NN regular DMT, where they kind of push through the veil and they're in this white light, and they have complete ego dissolution where they have no sense of self, they have no sense of body, they are sort of merging with source. That can definitely happen with NN DMT, but that's pretty much mostly the experience you get with the 5-MeO-DMT. There's no aliens, there's no weird worlds, there's really nothing to spend time looking at. It's you just get launched into immersive white light. I've had a couple 5-MeO-DMT experiences, and they are some of the most profound experiences I've ever had, and I've done plenty of psychedelics. And certainly, for me, forgetting who I was, what I was, that I was even a person, and just experiencing my energy as expanding and a part of this sort of globulating web of iridescent white infinite light, and feeling the vast expansiveness of that, and having an experience where there wasn't a separateness between me and the white light, that I was experiencing myself as the white light. And, many people would describe that as merging with God, merging with source, having an ego death experience or something of that, along the lines of that. And, and then when you come back, it's deeply shifting for people. It can be disorienting for people because it is hard to land from that, to leave your body and then come back and reorient to the sort of mundaneness of everyone around you and their, we get so used to this existence. And when you can take a step back and realize holy cow, this is a program that I'm getting to participate in and live in this body. And it can go a lot of different directions for people. But in my case, I just felt really inspired and grateful, and I felt like I was on ecstasy for the next 2 weeks, and I was sharing the experience with everybody because it was so earth-shattering for me. And I was calling my mom, you'll never believe it, and she's like, that's nice, honey, is that safe,
Fair enough.
Sharing it with people I probably shouldn't have been sharing it with, but it can be a profound experience.
Yeah, that's the shaman. I've only sat with ayahuasca twice, and the shaman that I worked with, he was. I asked that same question. He had a very very shaman Zen kind of answer, And I said, so what's the difference? Because at the end of the ceremony, he was talking about 5-MeO-DMT, and he had access to the Sonoran frog. And when I asked him, he said, Well, he's like, if you think of ayahuasca, it's sort of like conceptually, he's like, it's like the Mother Earth experience. It's more terrestrial. Like what you said, there's going to be, it's kind of organic and vine-like, and you're going to be seeing things kind of in the, what you would call the quote unquote terrestrial level. He's like, that medicine is Father Sky. Like you're up in, he's like, you're up into the ether, and it's expanded and just completely different. He's like, yeah, ayahuasca is like Mother Earth. That's like Father Sky. He's like, so think of it like that. And I was like, oh, that's a cool way to at least, conceptually think about it. But it's fascinating because I think that's a thread people have talked about, the people that I've connected with, and they say they've partaken in this medicine, and they've had very profound, ayahuasca changed my life, two sessions with that. My daughter was hospitalized when she was very young, and she's completely great now, no underlying condition, but she was hospitalized for a month, and we spent a month in the hospital. And I remember just being not right from it afterwards, that there was just, like you said, the trauma was quite real. And I had a dream about ayahuasca during that time, and that was like, in the dream, a woman was singing to me in an ayahuasca song, and I remember waking up thinking, like, was that a hint that I should probably go sit with that? 2-3 months later, it showed up, and it did 2 sessions. It really helped me. It like resolved that trauma and helped me see it in a way that was beneficial and harmonious. It's like there was growth to be had from it. But the other side of this is when I've talked to people about the 5-MeO DMT, much like what you have said, it's completely different. It's a completely different frequency. It's a completely different range, and people have a very different experience, and they sometimes have trouble plugging back into what you would call the regular 3D reality, just because it was so foreign. It was so different. Yeah. So, Caitlin, we're kind of at our window here, and that's strictly only, I could talk to you for hours, but I have Papa life, duties of Papa call soon. So, is there any parting words or ideas that you would like to leave the listeners with, just in regards to your experience, or things for people to consider as they potentially explore this world?
One of the things that I like to remind people is that, while you're on your healing journey, just keep going. Don't stop. Don't be discouraged, because, it's a really long journey, and it takes a lot of work, and it's not linear. And I just want to remind people that they're always worth it. They're worth the effort and the sacrifice of, putting themselves in, situations that they might be scared or uncomfortable or inconvenienced by, changing your lifestyle or your diet or the way that you show up in a relationship or whatever. And just reminding people that there's nothing more precious than health and happiness. And those two are absolutely linked, of course, and required for each other. And just, hoping to remind people that they're powerful and that they have the strength to get to a place where they're going to be able to thrive and be happy. Yeah. And if anyone wants to connect with me, I'm happy to connect. Probably the best way is through my website, EntheoZen.com. It's EntheoZen, EntheoZen.com. And you can reach out to me, through email there. You can also look at our products, and then I have other interviews and podcasts. I have a YouTube channel where I have videos on different supplements and different modalities, and just it's a growing channel, so it's not super decked out yet, but
same with
there's a lot of resources that I put out there on the internet through my website and my YouTube channel, just to share empowering information so that you can take that information and integrate it into your understanding of health and wellness and create that for yourself.
Absolutely. And you beat me to the question. That was my next question, was just how can people find you, which is great. Thank you for that little that last bit of information. And so what about social media? Sorry, I have my gardeners here. I hope that noise isn't too loud. But yeah, social media, where can people find you in terms of, do you have an Instagram? Do you have anything else that people can start following you?
I technically have an Instagram, and to be honest, I'm not very active, because I'm like, what am I going to do? Take pictures of supplements? I guess I could do something with it. I have a Facebook. I also have a Twitter that I'm not super active on. But yeah, our Facebook profile is mostly active, and I post all sorts of really cool articles. We have a newsletter if you want to sign up for that. I don't send a lot of spammy stuff. If you type in EntheoZen to Google, you're going to find me because it's a made-up word that I created. So you'll find all things EntheoZen related if you just Google that. And you can always email me and ask me if there's a specific resource that you're looking for.
Okay, awesome. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for your time and for the work that you're doing. I think it's fascinating work and, God, so beneficial and so needed right now. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay.
I do this work not only for others, but for myself.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.